Good afternoon, welcome to this evening's edition of Tysky Sow. I'm Aaron Bastani, I'm filling in for Michael Walker, and you will not be surprised, I'm sure, to hear that we are talking about climate change. Last Monday was the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, and that protest is ongoing where they shut down critical infrastructure across London. More than 1,000 arrests have been made. One of our guests has just come from there. But we're not just talking about Extinction Rebellion, we're also talking about the Green New Deal, climate strikes, and what seems to be, really since the beginning of the year, a renewal, a reinvigoration around the debate on climate change, but also how to politically deal with it. Tonight's guests could not be better. Very happy to be joined by them. Ann Pettifor, the author of Production of Money with Verse. That was out in 2017, wasn't it? Yeah. We did a great podcast with you and Grace Blakely, in fact.
Yeah.
Before she became incredibly famous. And you have a book coming out soon on financing the Green New Deal.
That's right, yeah. How to finance the Green... Costing the Earth, how to finance the Green New Deal.
And when can we expect that?
Well, we'd like to have it out in the autumn if I can get it written.
Because that's going to be a really important book, right?
Well, I hope so.
And you were one of the sort of major figures behind the idea of the Green New Deal back in 2008, weren't you?
Yes, I mean, we weren't the originators of it, to be fair. That was the idea of an American journalist, but we cottoned onto it pretty quickly. He wrote his column in 2007, and in the winter of 2007, we convened in my flat, and we began to thrash out the key principles of the Green New Deal, and we published it eventually in July 2008.
And that was intended to be something of a response, not just to climate change, but also the global financial crisis.
Yes, it was in the midst of the global financial crisis, Aaron. And, it was picked up by Gordon Brown, it was picked up by UNEP, the UN, and so on. But the sad thing was we published it before the collapse of Lehman's, and it was sort of eclipsed by that crisis, I mean, in fact, the global financial crisis had started a year before, but people hadn't really registered how serious it was until Lehman's, and unfortunately, our work was just lost in all that, sadly. But it was picked up by Greens in Europe, and it was picked up by Barack Obama for his presidential campaign. But it took AOC to turn it into a huge, big international issue.
And we've got George Monbiot, another very vital voice on this stuff for years, but it now seems that people like yourself and Anne are coming back to the fore because these issues are more relevant than they've been. You were on Frankie Boyle, what's it called again? The New World Order?
That's right, Frankie Boyle's New World Order.
Last week, and I think we're going to play an excerpt from that. We shared it on the Vara Media's Facebook page. It's been shared 40,000 times.
What would you say people should do, George, if they can do one thing?
I mean, what we have to do is the big structural political economic stuff. What we're being told to do is change your cotton buds and all these sort of pathetic micro-consumerist bollocks, which just isn't going to get us anywhere. There are one or two things you can do as a consumer which do make change. Switch to a plant-based diet. That's one. Big change, because animal farming has this massive environmental impact. Another one, stop flying. Yeah, but beyond that, actually everything we have to do is change the system. We have to overthrow this system which is eating the planet with perpetual growth. I mean, since when was GDP a sensible measure of human welfare? And yet everything that governments want to do is to try to boost GDP. Now, people like the OECD or the World Bank who say, we're not asking for a lot of growth, just 3% a year. That means doubling in 24 years. Yeah, we're bursting through all the environmental boundaries and screwing the planet already. You want to double it? Double all that? Double it again? Keep doubling it? It's madness. We've got to find a better way of measuring human welfare than perpetual growth. We've got to start ramping down all fossil fuel production and leave fossil fuels in the ground. And at the same time, and this is a nice bit of it, it turns out that through massive rewilding, ecological restoration, you can draw down a load of the carbon dioxide we've already produced. Huge amounts, allowing the forests to come back, the marshes to come back, the sea floor to recover from trawling and stuff. They draw down carbon dioxide and can take us a long way towards stopping climate breakdown at the same time as stopping ecological breakdown. There's time, but we can't do it by just pissing around at the margins of the problem. We've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism and overthrow it.
Amazing. And you tweeted about this, and we were talking about it before coming on air, that you don't think that kind of analysis, that kind of conclusion would have been possible actually on a conventional current affairs programme on the BBC.
It's been deliberately excluded. You cannot make a systemic critique of capitalism, of our political economy, on either current affairs programmes or on documentaries. The only place you can do it is on a comedy show. If you want to get serious, you've got to go onto comedy. I'm not kidding with this. It's right across the broadcast media. There's been a total fatwa on deep systemic challenges to the system, and it is disgraceful. It's the biggest form of bias. Oh, incidentally, sorry, challenges to the system from the left. If you're on the right, if you're Nigel Farage, or if you're one of these corporate-funded lobby groups, dark money-funded lobby groups, which call themselves think tanks, like the Institute of Economic Affairs, Adam Smith Institute, if you're spiked, if you're any of these people, they'll have you on to say, basically, destroy the administrative state, rip down regulation, rip down taxation. Taxpayers Alliance has another one. Tear the whole thing up. But if you want to challenge it from the left, and if you want to say, look, we need to ask some very deep and serious questions about the entire basis of our economy and of our political system, forget it. You won't get any airtime at all until some crazy comedian invites you on.
Is that your experience, Anne?
Well, I've been excluded for some time now. But having said that, I think that's a really big problem. I haven't got involved in Brexit, and so lately I haven't been on very much. And I did challenge austerity early on in the day and managed to get on some shows. But I think you're absolutely right. The BBC is terrified of any fundamental challenge to the existing political economy, this existing economic system, and what that might mean. But above all, the BBC has been so afraid of what I think George correctly calls climate breakdown. It's not climate change, it's climate breakdown. It's worse than that, actually. It's Earth systems breakdown.
Yeah.
And the BBC has not, and David Attenborough and all of those natural history people have not been able to utter the words, have not been allowed to utter the words.
Do you think they'd like to?
Well, I can't believe that David Attenborough has travelled all these years, these decades, and not been aware of what's happening. I think Chris Packham, for example, is aware, but is clearly very carefully curtailed in what he can say. So, but it's just overall that there is a failure, and it takes a 16-year-old schoolgirl to get onto the Today programme, really, mainly because she's perceived as a sort of novelty, really. It is deeply worrying. But I think we should get on with doing what we're doing, because the fact of the matter is that this week has transformed the debate. And we should be pleased about that. It is very late, it's far too late, but at last, it's on the agenda.
So, George, you've just come back from the Extinction Rebellion camp in Marble Arch.
Yeah, that's right. It was touch and go whether I was going to get here, because while I was doing a talk on the stage got surrounded by police. And but it soon became unclear whether the police were kettling us or we were kettling the police. I think they'd come for the sound system. I thought they'd actually come to clear the whole site, which they are obviously aiming to do as well. But so there was a bit of a standoff, and eventually I slipped out and managed to get to Bermondsey.
Wow.
But it's still a great atmosphere there. It's, they're really amazing, impressive, wonderful people. I mean, I'm feeling a bit rubbish at the moment. My health's not so good, but honestly, I felt so much better being there. It's like a tonic. They should put it on prescription. Go to the Extinction Rebellion, and you'll feel 10 times better, because I do. It's amazing, and they have. You're right. They've transformed the debate. It is absolutely true. It's where we are in relation to people's understanding of the problem, of people's willingness to talk about the problem, is a completely different place to a fortnight ago.
Absolutely. They must be given credit for that. Huge credit.
And so they've got 3 demands.
Yeah.
Firstly, for the governments to declare a climate emergency.
Yes.
decarbonise by 2025 and having a citizens' assembly around climate.
Yeah.
What do you think of those as a set of demands, Anne?
Well, I think they're right. They're radical and they're correct. And I mean, it is definitely an emergency. And yes, the sooner we decarbonise, the better. And the Citizens' Assembly, yes, we need a participatory process for this to work. But it's not enough, really, because for me, and for the Green New Deal, there is there's the synchronization, the integration of the economy with the ecology, with the climate, and so we've got to change the system, and we've got to talk about the economic system and the way it drives climate breakdown, basically. And I just don't feel that has been said enough. I hate to be critical of how effective they've been in raising this issue. But I also think that it has been a weakness of the green movement, if you like, that we've tended to talk about the environment as being a silo and the economy as being something that chaps in pinstripe suits manage. And that's not for us, really. And we don't express a view on it. But the fact of the matter is that our financialized, globalized economy is designed to create enormous quantities of credit at very high rates, real rates of interest, to fuel consumption. And it's that consumption, that easy money, it's expensive, costly money, but it's easy. You can get it just by applying for a credit card and go on the web and purchase as much as you like. And it's as if credit is the fuel driving consumption, which in turn is driving emissions, and it's making those connections and asking for that system to change, and for us to focus less on our wants, which are satisfied, if you like, by consumption and by credit, and to focus more on our needs, our fundamental human needs. And our economy doesn't do that. It focuses on our wants because it knows that wants can be limitless. Our needs for housing, for water, for health, for autonomy, for education, all of these things, and for jobs, these are limited, and we can easily and sustainably provide them. We can't provide for unsustainable and exponentially rising consumption. But our economic system fuels that. And I just wish we could talk about that with more confidence, because really we know it. We all know it. We see it all around us. We understand that that's the problem. But we don't talk about it enough in order to be able to use it to tackle, because I think we've got to do both, Oil.
Do you think Extinction Rebellion are failing to do that?
Don't want to think of them as failing, because what they have tried to do is to succeed in explaining to us how serious and how, well, I don't know, how traumatic the climate breakdown is, and Earth systems breakdown is, and what a deep and profound threat it is. But I just want to hear more about, what are we going to do about a system which makes it work? I mean, if you read the Financial Times today, there's a little story about Extinction Rebellion, but the big story is that the price of oil is rising, and that this is going to be very profitable for a lot of people, and it's going to help some countries to do very well, including Iran, and that's the focus. And there's no question about whether or not this oil could become a stranded asset, as the governor of the Bank of England has called it. There's just the assumption that we're going to go on spewing this stuff out, and that the price is rising, and that's good for the big oil companies. That's the story, and we must challenge that story, as well as talk about the climate and the system, the Earth's systems.
George, do you think they've sort of lacked a compelling account of what their demands, or how their demands relate to a sort of more general understanding of the economy of growth?
I think there's a danger of asking too much of Extinction Rebellion, and asking them to have the answer to that, the answer to policing, the answer to exclusion in this country. I mean, I've seen lots of critiques of people saying, oh, they should be talking about this, and they should be doing that, and they're doing this all wrong. And actually, what they're doing is opening up a space, and it's a space which creates opportunities for other people like ourselves to talk right now. You know, we're having this conversation precisely because they've opened up that space, and we can talk about stuff which is much harder to talk about when you're having to represent the views of thousands of people all at the same time. You're having to keep it really simple because you want to reach Daily Mail readers as well as Guardian readers, as well as people who think the Guardian is somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun. You know, you want to, they're trying to reach as wide a group of people as they possibly can with some very simple, easily graspable messages, while most importantly, creating such a spectacle, such an involvement in civil disruption that they cannot be ignored. And that is a crucial thing. It's what they're doing as much as what they're saying. Of those demands, I think the most radical is tell the truth, because as we were saying, this has been the great failure. The great failure by the media, the great failure by politics, and as Greta Thunberg says, the truth you need to be telling is a scientific truth, and your action should follow from that. And if politics and economics were based around scientific realities, they would look very different indeed. But at the moment, we're told that the non-negotiable is the so-called political reality, and that scientific realities are negotiable. Sorry, they aren't. You can't negotiate with physics. It's not even around the table to be negotiated with, whereas actually political realities are highly contingent on circumstance. Something which seems completely impossible today, tomorrow suddenly becomes possible. That's what happens in politics, isn't it? And you can have long periods of stasis punctuated by sudden rupture. And I think what Extinction Rebellion are doing is helping to precipitate sudden rupture.
But do you not think that, I personally agree with your account, and I've seen people, for instance, say, well, they've got a bad attitude towards the police, etc., which I happen to agree with, but it's perfectly possible that that's immaterial in relation to a movement that wants to make climate change a salient issue. So if 40% of the public said climate change was a massive issue 2 weeks ago, and today it's 65%, you don't need a theory of the state to legitimise your success. You've done that. You've been successful. But the sort of counter-argument is that things like the Green New Deal, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, she was only been in Congress since January. It's been rapid. That was beginning to change ideas and prejudices around green activism. It had begun to become more of a sort of modern, almost technocratic politics, and what this is doing is actually returning it to modes of direct action, hippieism, lifestyle politics. Do you buy that, Anne? What do you think about that?
No, I very much do, but I think it's also unfair to her because she came to it, from her own positive activism around the pipeline issues in the States and so on. So yes, but the point is, she's taking it into the administrative state in order to achieve some sort of transformation. And that is where the focus has been. And you're quite right. The Extinction Rebellion have brought it back to the science, to the physics, to the inevitability of it, to the tipping point issues. And that's right. The question is, and I agree with George, because, I was born in South Africa. I never thought for a moment that the apartheid regime would collapse. In the way that it did. It just simply one day, fell over.
Shatters like a windscreen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, it was so improbable because it was so powerful and it was backed by a military and a secret service that, since then we've learnt much more about how incredibly well financed that was and how powerful it was. And I remember living under it and how oppressive it was. And it didn't occur to me for a moment that we could break through that and boom, one day it's all over. And of course the same with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, I was just reading this book by Alexei Yurchak just last week called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. And this belief, this sense that this is the only possible system and it's immutable. It's all-encompassing. It penetrates every fibre of our being. We cannot imagine a different world. And then suddenly it collapses, and then retrospectively people say, well, of course it was going to collapse. It's obvious it was going to collapse. It had all these inherent flaws and weaknesses, and suddenly you can imagine a different world. And so what this tells to me is that political failure is at heart a failure of imagination. Our overwhelming task, and this is why I think telling the truth is such a radical act, our overwhelming task is to imagine a different system, is to picture it in our heads, then to sort of make it more and more real in our minds by showing how this system could work, by putting in the building blocks, and then suddenly that becomes a viable political strategy and a new political reality.
Yes.
And then you can have that sudden change of state, that flip, that tipping point from one system to the next. And so, and why I'm so delighted to be in the discussion with both of you is all three of us are in the business of imagining a different system and of sort of smashing the wall with the power of imagination. That is the demolition ball, is that ability to imagine something beyond the wall which is entirely different to where we are within the wall, and we smash the system with the power of imagination.
Yeah.
Does the Green New Deal have to do the same thing? Does the Green New Deal not just have to be a set of demands, decarbonise by then, create this infrastructure? Does it also need to mobilise a certain narrative of what the good society, the good life might be? And would it fail in the absence of that?
Absolutely. I mean, what's so important about what was the New Deal, and there was lots wrong with it. It was racist for a start, and it was sectarian in the sense, for example, that Roosevelt introduced the minimum wage. And the Southern Democrats said, you can have a minimum wage for white people, but we ain't having it for black people, So there was a lot wrong. And Roosevelt went along for that for political reasons. But what the New Deal generated was, funnily enough, Susan George wrote about this not long ago, was a sense of solidarity. Solidarity, within society. And the sense of we can do something and we can change this. And, they had a huge ecological crisis then too. They had the Dust Bowl and they planted, I don't know how many billions of trees. They had this conservation corps which employed people and which went round sort of shoring up the Dust Bowl and planting forests and maintaining forests, and transforming the landscape and doing it within a very short period. And then, as Susan George explains, they had to prepare for war. Again, they did that overnight, and they were, they transformed. The lipstick factory became a cartridge factory overnight. So, but the thing was, what also was engendered was number one, the subordination of Wall Street to the interests of the whole community, and that, I just don't think people fully understand how powerful that is in changing the balance of power in society. And one of the things that really is so hard is that, for example, right now, the New Deal, the Green New Deal in the United States is being clobbered by Fox News and by the right. The right, there's an opinion poll that shows that the right, the Republican right, have heard of the Green New Deal. The Democrats are not as nearly as aware, people who vote Democrat are not as aware of the Green New Deal as the right are. And the right are 91% against it, thanks to Fox News and thanks to propaganda. So what this is a power imbalance. And that power imbalance comes from money, it comes from the media, the Murdoch, and the money that fuels Fox News. This is Murdoch's money, right? This ain't small beer, this is big beer. Now, what the New Deal did was to alter that balance of power. Wall Street was suddenly made less important. Government spending enriched an awful lot of other people, but just somehow changed the balance of power in society and increased the sense of solidarity. So I think that's very important to do. The fact that Murdoch has the facility to use his money to move it around as easily as it does and to fuel it and to use it for the purposes of public propaganda is something that we should be able to change. But we can only do that once we get the power to do that. So I'm waffling here, but there are big political power issues.
Is it just the fault of Fox News? Because one might argue, well, the liberal media is also powerful in the US. You've got the New York Times, MSNBC.
Yes.
Is it simply a fact that the sort of liberal patrician elite, Nancy Pelosi, aren't on board with this, and while the Republicans have an understanding of their class interest,
yes,
the Democrats are very much sort of fragmented institution when it comes to climate change or transitioning beyond fossil
I think
fuels?
it's absolutely about the collapse of social democracy in the United States and in Europe and here in Britain, save for the Corbyn Labour Party. That has created a political vacuum in the United States as well as in Europe, and that is partly why the right is so triumphant at the moment, and that paralysis, that collapse, is epitomised by Nancy Pelosi's. What is this about? It's a bit of a fairy thing, isn't it?
And I think deeper than that, it's the absence of a new narrative.
Yes.
I mean, narratives are absolutely crucial in politics, and a particular narrative structure as well. This restoration story, which says, the land has been thrown into disorder by a powerful and nefarious elite working against the interests of humanity, but the hero of the story, or the heroes, it might be the ordinary people of the land, overthrow them against the odds, restore order to the land. Now, Keynes did that very successfully in the wake of the Great Depression. The neoliberals did that very successfully and helped to bring down Keynesianism with it. Neoliberalism collapsed spectacularly in 2008, exposed as economically, politically, socially bankrupt. And just bankrupt.
And then rose from the ashes.
Well, and because we came forward and said, right, what we need to do instead is, actually, we're not quite sure. Maybe do we need to go back to Keynesianism, or do we have a bit less neoliberalism?
Exactly.
We didn't have a compelling new restoration story with which to replace it, and so. Everyone then is at sea, and the Nancy Pelosi tendency, it really exemplifies that. It's like they don't know what they want. They're just sort of floating around looking for political realities. This is, we'll just line up with what we perceive to be the political realities, and we'll be led by them rather than leading them with a powerful, compelling narrative.
I think it's worse than that, George. I think they're corrupted by money.
There's that as well, of course. Yes, absolutely. I mean,
that's the thing
but
about the power of money to corrupt all of our politics.
It's very true, but I suspect that even if Nancy Pelosi and her like, Dianne Feinstein and the rest, were not corrupted by money, and that they would still be useless, because actually they don't, they don't have a vision, they don't have a narrative, they don't have a transformative view of the system that they want to create, and so they're always going to be fighting rearguard actions, responding to the agenda of their opponents, being an oppositional movement rather than a propositional movement. And until you turn that around and force your opponents to respond to you, you're stuffed. You're not going anywhere. You're just going to be a constant series of retrenchments.
Here's a question for both of you then. Let's say the US makes no effort to, reduce climate emissions. Obviously, nobody's meeting their sort of Paris targets anyway, except, if the Marshall Islands or whatever, maybe Japan.
Costa Rica.
But no, I mean, that's just a rhetorical thing anyway. But let's say the US goes nowhere on this, and it doesn't even really begin decarbonising for decades, right? Until the 2040s or something absolutely reprehensible. Who is more to blame for that? Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump? Now, I know the easy answer is Donald Trump because he's the president. Ultimately, he's responsible for a lot of things that Nancy Pelosi isn't. But clearly, like you say, there is a tendency in US politics which is quite large, and it would be described as a Nancy Pelosi tendency, and has lots of resources. So are these people to blame for where we are and where we're going? And if they are, how can socialists or people who want to change this, social democrats, how should they relate to them?
I think I can say with some confidence, yes, they are to blame. The fact that we have Trump is because of the collapse of social democracy under Clinton and also Obama. The financial crisis should have been a transformative moment. It turned out to be a moment in which the existing order consolidated itself and became stronger. The amount of debt that's been created since the crisis is now, it's much more than it was before the crisis. It's now 3.5 times global GDP. What's going on out there in the financial stratosphere is unbelievable, really, and unbelievable sums of money are being made. And that's another reason why, and I agree entirely with what George is saying, is that we can't ignore those guys. They're out there doing this, screwing the system, and we have a blind spot for it in a way. So yes, they are to blame, but I think it's even worse than that, Aaron. I have this horrible sense that what's at stake, and I don't think we really fully grasp this, is civilization, if you like. We're facing climate and earth system catastrophe, but we already have political and social catastrophe. The bombings in Sri Lanka and in New Zealand, these are barbaric acts, really. So we're finding, and then we have the election of a television star in Ukraine. This is all crazy right-wing authoritarian politics which could lead us into what I fear would be the collapse of civilization, really. And whether that comes before we have the collapse of the climate, I don't know. I think we're at that point. So it's worse than just political failure. It's a kind of social and political breakdown, which I fear, is already happening. Somehow we're insulated a little bit from it here, but there's. I'm not being very coherent, but I do find.
Sadly, you are being very coherent.
I find all this, this mindless killing of people, and it's mindless because people don't know how else to react. How angry they are, why they vote for Trump, why they turn up at his events, is because they just don't know how. There is, as you say, George, there isn't a narrative, there isn't a channel, there isn't leadership, which leads them into a more progressive position.
And for this reason, I don't really think that either Pelosi or Trump are to blame. I see them both as products of the system, and products of a system that will necessarily, if it is not replaced, eat the earth and its people, destroy our life support systems, and this system is capitalism. It is a system which has two intrinsic features, irreducible features, that are like a gun pointed at our earth systems. One of them is economic growth, the aggregate of the pursuit of capital accumulation and profit. And without economic growth, capitalism dies. With economic growth, the planet dies, because perpetual growth on a finite planet is simply not possible. Yeah. The second one is almost a foundational belief of capitalism, which is that you have as much right to acquire natural wealth as your money allows. So you can acquire as much of the world's resources, of our common resources, as the money in your bank says you can acquire. It is utterly preposterous. It's a totally bizarre, crazy belief with no justification whatsoever, but it is the foundational belief of capitalism. And what this does is to greatly accelerate all the impacts of economic growth. Is you have this scramble for non-reproducible assets, which then generates violence, generates a legislative truncation of people's rights, generates oligarchy, and all the other problems that we're responding to and reacting to. And we do tend at the moment to be quite reactive and to look at the symptoms of the problem. The problem is this earth-eating system called capitalism, and that is what we have to see beyond. That is where the imaginative act comes in. That we have to create a wholly new system which does not have those features, because it doesn't really matter. It's only a matter of a few years whether the Pelosi version of capitalism or the Trump version of capitalism, or even for that matter the social democratic version of capitalism, is the dominant version. Whichever one it is, it will destroy the world's living systems and us into the bargain. And that's the level on which we have to operate. We can't assign blame to individuals within that system. It is the system.
I agree with George about that, and I'm very glad he raised the question of growth, because I want to.
That's what I want to talk about.
I want to say to Greens, please do not let us use the word. It is the way in which neoliberals have framed the economy, and they did it actually, George, quite recently. In the late 1960s, the OECD, working with the Financial Times, Samuel Britton of the Financial Times, decided that the economy should grow at the same rate as the now deregulated finance sector was growing. And that can grow exponentially. Credit can grow exponentially because it's created out of thin air, if you like, but also if you charge very high rates of interest, that too can, therefore the debt can grow exponentially. And so people who were making money from money were finding that they could grow exponentially. But the real economy, based on real assets, finite assets, based on human labor, was not growing at that exponential rate. So they invented the term growth and set a target for the British economy in the 1960s for it to grow at 50% over 10 years. And this was at a time of full employment, right? It was a crazy thing. It caused inflation, it caused instability, it caused financial crises, and of course the Labour Party and the Labour movement were blamed for it, for all that inflation and so on. And so that...
Who was responsible for it?
This was the OECD and Sam Britton. And Sam Britton wrote a book called The Growth Men. And so this was about how they began to set a new target for the British economy, and they called it growth. And it was going to be exponential. It was going to grow at the same rate as the financial sector was growing. And the real economy can't grow at the same rate as the financial sector can grow. So I want us to stop using even degrowth, because it's the framing question.
Yeah.
It's the question of buying into a way of thinking about the economy as growing exponentially, when what we should be talking about is the level of the level of the economy. Are the levels sustainable? Are levels of our activity?
The scientific reality must be the thing that is our baseline,
yes.
our compass point.
No,
is
exactly.
a scientific reality. Yeah.
So, what level of extraction of assets are there? What level of extraction of labour is there? And so on and so forth. So, what is the level of investment? What is the level of labour activity, economic activity? All of these levels are what we calculated before. We calculated levels of activity within the economy, and suddenly we were told to calculate only exponential growth. And I want us never to use the word, because we buy into that whole theory, as George says, of exponential expansion, and it's not possible.
Obviously, GDP, gross domestic product growth, very interconnected. Kuznets said, please don't measure human... There was a gentleman behind the idea of GDP, said, please don't measure human progress with GDP. But in this era, we obviously still live in a democratic era. Mass public participation, one person, one vote in the UK, US, number of other countries. It makes it very easy to understand when you say 2.5% GDP, we're growing so well. You've got a sort of technocratic class who you get the Economist every week, and literally at the back, almost like the football results, you've got the GDP scores.
Yeah.
Do you not think that socialists or post-capitalists, whatever you want to call them, do you not think that we similarly would need some kind of metric by which to judge the success of any potential economic system?
Yes, and I do want to take on this point, because I heard what George said about GDP. GDP is, if you think of a car and the speedometer on the car, the speedometer tells you the rate at which you're travelling, the speed at which you're travelling. And the speedometer is not the problem. The problem is the accelerator. The problem is the driver behind the wheel. The problem is the car, capitalism. The measure of what's happening, and the GDP is a measure. The GDP is a measure of the total activity, as far as we can count it. We count up. We can count how many people are in employment. We can count how much money is going into green technology. These things are countable, and the fact that we can count them is okay, in my view, is not a problem. The question really is the driving force behind GDP. What is it? It is that GDP must rise, as you say, every week, the football score of it rising up, up, up. It must never go down, And in fact, GDP has to go down. We have to extract less from the earth. We have to exclude fossil fuels from our counting. We've just got to block them out.
Didn't Kuznets, didn't he say that finance shouldn't be included in GDP? I mean, this has been a debate, hasn't it? Or,
no, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, that should not be included, because that's all very complicated. We don't want to get into too much.
They need to buy your book for that one.
Yeah, but the point is that these are intangibles, and these are intangibles. But mainly because, it's all too complicated, but we've turned intangible things like trust into assets. We've commodified absolutely almost everything we could possibly commodify and modify and monetize as capitalism. And that's all crazy. We must stop doing that too. But we'll never stop counting. I hope we don't, because for me that is what science does. We have to measure how much oil is coming out of the earth and how much must stay behind, and someone's got to do that measuring. But the question we really have to address is, do we extract that oil or not? Those are the big issues.
Yeah, there's a really interesting paper just been published by Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallos, looking at this whole idea of green growth. So can we dematerialize growth? Can we decouple economic growth from material resource consumption? And it's a very thorough paper. It's a very good one, and it shows definitively we cannot. That there, while there was some relative.
What's the citation for this for viewers?
It's new. I think it's called New Political Economy or something. It's a new journal actually. I think this is its very first edition. Jason Hickel and Georgios Kallos.
And I think the title is Degrowth.
Yeah, it's something like. Is green growth possible? I think that's the title. Right. So, anyway, it's a very rigorous look at this question because it's intrinsic to all the models. If you look at UNEP, if you look at OECD, if you look at the World Bank, they all say, "Oh, it's fine because we'll just decouple. We'll decouple growth. We're switching from goods to services, so it's going to happen anyway. We'll just dematerialize the economy." Yeah. It's not happening. I mean, what's so interesting is that during the 20th century. There was some relative decoupling. In other words, material resource use was still rising, but it was rising more slowly than economic growth, than GDP rate. In the 21st century, there's been a recoupling where material resource use is rising as fast or faster than GDP. And we're going in exactly the wrong direction if that's what you want to do. As for the absolute decoupling, in other words, an overall reduction in material resource use, they demonstrate pretty convincingly that it is physically impossible while an economy is growing. You just cannot do it. And they've done a very thorough literature survey. It's terrifying. And you basically come to the end of that and say, you cannot continue to have economic growth and continue to have life on Earth. The two things are incompatible.
Can I just respond quickly, and then I'll get your opinions on this. So we know, for instance, in the US, UK, most of Europe, carbon emissions have been falling since about 2000. Although GDP, although quite slowly in this country since 2000, it's still gone up. So there has been something of a sort of... The argument is that there's basically a sort of hard limit on the amount of CO2 emissions a country per capita will emit. Almost like, there was declining birth rates, increased life expectancy. Now they're saying that one of the sort of hallmarks of capitalist development is a cap on carbon emissions. Do you think that's simply because all the production's being done in the global south, or is
there's a couple of things to say here. So while there has been no absolute decoupling of material resource use, and there can't be with economic growth, with carbon production, carbon dioxide production, there has been an absolute decoupling, even taking into account outsourced emissions elsewhere. What the paper shows is that is nowhere near enough to hit the targets which we're signed up to under the Paris Agreement, let alone what we actually need to do if we're going to produce no more than 1.5 degrees of global heating, let alone 2 degrees or even 2 degrees of global heating. I mean, they're saying, if economic growth continues, you're talking about 7, 8, maybe 11, 12% cuts per year in order to meet those targets. And, that is 3, 4, 5 times what any economy has managed to achieve. So again, while you can look at this and say, we've got the lowest emissions per capita we've had since 1888 or something like that in this country. Isn't that an amazing achievement? And you say, actually, by comparison to where we need to be, it's nothing. It's nowhere near.
And furthermore, we'd already stocked the atmosphere with full of carbon anyway, thanks to past activities. But you see, the thing is, I think I'm going to diverge here from you, George, on this point, because for me, a green and a sustainable economy will be a high employment economy. For me, labour will have to substitute for carbon. We're going to have to grow our own green beans. We're not going to be able to import them by plane. We're going to have to walk. We're going to have to become much more nationally self-sufficient, and that's going to be labour intensive. And I have been on platforms with green MEPs and so on who've argued that actually no, we have to have high levels of unemployment. So when we talk about growth, and I don't want us to talk about that because it's such a neoliberal concept, I want us to talk about what level of economic activity would be sustainable and how much of that should we devote towards labour, and how much of labour must be labour, for example, in activities that don't use material resources, education, the arts, creativity, care, all of those things. There's an awful lot to be done, in my view, that doesn't need to be fueled by carbon. And how much of that, how are we going to organise a society to make it sustainable? And whenever I talk about this, I think of Egypt, and I think of the millions of young unemployed people in Egypt, and I think of the ecological devastation that is the result of a society living on high levels of unemployment. So I don't want to ever talk about growth, but I do want to talk about what kind of economic activity would we require to maintain our solidarity, our civilization, our ability to live in community. And for me, we've got to be talking about national self-sufficiency far more. We've got to be self-sufficient. We've got to, feed ourselves. We've got to be able to make our own clothes. We've got to be able to walk around and cycle around. These are all things we're going to have to think about and envisage a new world. But it's going to have some economic activity in it, and we've just got to address that.
Can I respond to both of you here? Because we've talked a bit about GDP growth, but you've talked about something important there, which is the nation state.
Yeah.
And the importance of returning to sort of nationally oriented economies. I agree with you. I don't see how else you're going to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And often the cliche amongst the left is, because Marx made this observation correctly, over time production becomes ever more socialised, ever more globalised. Well, actually, when it comes to agriculture, we probably need to deglobalize quite significantly.
Absolutely.
But the left would say that's, that's actually, that's almost foreshadowing the possibility of a return of national socialism. And do you think that's a sort of a bit of a lacuna for the left, where they don't really engage with the national question, not the national as an identitarian issue, but the nation state as that locus of economic production?
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with it, and I think there is a worry there about nationalism, and I'm deeply against nationalism, having grown up in a nationalist state. What I think is really important is the idea of self-sufficiency, of not having to extract assets from other parts of the world for our own survival purposes. But there will be countries, and they are in Africa, which cannot be self-sufficient on their own because they're too small. They will want to have regional alliances, and they will want to work together with their neighbours, who will have more water or more land or be able to grow things they can't grow or whatever. So, I don't think it's... What I think the important concept is self-sufficiency, is the idea that you cannot live by just exploiting other parts of the world and by importing, exporting, all this stuff. This is not going to be sustainable.
I say that because Rio Earth Summit's 1992, and since then, the sort of common sense, which has percolated all the way down to your everyday sort of liberal left activist, is we can only have global solutions to this.
No, that's rubbish.
In a sense, it's true. I mean, Britain's only like 2% of world CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it seems to me, I mean, let's see what you think about this, George, that's almost provided a license for sort of political inertia. And even worse than not doing anything, it's given almost the outward appearance of doing something and being invested in actually transitioning the economy, where in fact that was never really on the table.
Can I just say this quickly, that when we were running the Jubilee 2000 campaign, the World Bank and the big charities in the United States wanted us to play a part in growing a global civil society to match global capitalism. A global civil society was going to hold capitalism to account. And I said, no, we're not playing that game, right? Because a global civil society is accountable to whom?
Doesn't exist, right?
No,
that's my opinion.
and the idea, all you're asking us to do is to reinforce global capitalism. No, thank you. Having said that, we want international cooperation and coordination. We want to be able to work with our neighbours, and we want international alliances. But we don't want a sort of globalised state, which is what globalisation is and wants, basically, in my view.
There are certain issues which can only be dealt with through global
George, can we talk about international? Is it international?
Actually, no, I'd much rather talk about global, because international suggests that everything has to be brokered through nation states. I would much rather create communities of interest which don't rely on nation states to represent us at the global level, because we never elect nation states or national governments to represent us at the global level. We always have domestic issues in mind, and yet our interests, when it comes to climate breakdown or Earth systems breakdown, are the same interests as a farmer in Malawi.
Yeah.
The same interests as someone living in a city in Colombia.
Yeah.
And so what we see now is coordinations which sort of bypass and subvert the nation state, such as the cities getting together. I mean, a lot of progressive mayors around the world are getting together to engage with climate breakdown. So, and that's globalization rather than internationalism. In a way, we've been using the wrong terms. We've almost been using them the wrong way round. And it seems to me this is a very complex and interesting question, because we have seen how nation states have inhibited the creation of global solidarity over crucial issues, but we've also seen how globalization, which has its positive political aspects, has been used in catastrophic, particularly economic ways, and basically capitalism relies on turning other places into sacrifice zones, externalizing your costs, where you seize resources from elsewhere, you dump your waste elsewhere, and it's based on slavery and extraction and exploitative colonial relations.
But there's no model for a transition or a level of collective action on the scale that we all agree is necessary
at a global level
without the nation state. I mean,
it's not, George, I think the fact is that I hear what you're saying about how a state and the nation state doesn't represent us in international fora, but that's a feature of the last 30 years. That's a feature of neoliberalism. We had a period between 1945 and 1971 under the Bretton Woods arrangements when we were institutionally structured, if you like. The global economy, the architecture of the global economy was one in which people were nations were instructed to coordinate and to cooperate, to maintain balance across the world.
Romana established by the United States, where the international trading currency was the dollar. I mean, it was it was a stitch up. The World Bank and the IMF, where the US has a unique veto over both organisations, where basically the rich countries determine what happens in the poor world. That is no sort of model, and we can get very romantic about the social democratic era and completely forget the exploitative relations within it.
No, we don't disagree over the imperialist role of the dollar and of the United States.
And
I'm merely
Bank,
saying,
and the IMF,
and the
UN
IMF,
Security
and the way in
Council,
which
and all those other post-war institutions.
But to be honest, those post-war institutions didn't turn into those oppressive institutions until deregulation, until Nixon unilaterally bailed out of the Bretton Woods system. We had a system post-war of cooperation and coordination between states for the purposes of maintaining peace.
Between the rich states basically collectively agreeing to exploit the poor states. I mean,
that's not
and
fair.
Keynes warned about this, and this is why. Yeah. He proposed a completely different system, an international clearing union with an international trading currency, the Bancor, and it was just slapped down by the US, which created this hegemonic system.
That's the case. Yeah.
But
I think this is a really important area.
It's very
of
important.
debate.
No, it's very critically important. I mean, I could do it for hours, but we haven't got all evening. But I think we should probably do some sort of a debate between you two, sort of Peterson versus Zizek.
Oh no, please.
Yeah, or just on this,
don't compare us.
No, can we have a social democracy 2.0? That'd be a great debate, because that's fundamentally what the left has to determine. We're going to go to some questions in a second. We'll finish at about 10 past, if that's all right, because we started a bit late. Yeah. Let's get some questions in. So if you want to ask any questions to George, to Anne, to myself, to all of us, we'll try and answer some of them very quickly. 2 questions for both of you. Nice and quick, because we'll try and get these more important questions in, not my boring ones. Firstly, do we all need to become vegans? Because this was something that George isolated, and I agree with you. Personal solutions generally I don't really like, but that is a very important thing. Secondly, is Emma Thompson a hypocrite for flying from the West Coast to talk at a climate change protest? Anne?
Well, first of all, yes, I think plant-based diets are absolutely essential, and I agree with George on that. On Emma Thompson, I don't know. I really don't know.
You're so nice. You're not criticising, do you? It's quite commendable.
I mean, of course she shouldn't fly. And I'm critical of people that are flying, but I'm also conscious that globalization has scattered us around the world. Families are split and so on. I mean, I think it is probably not convincing that you stand up on the platform while at the same time flying around the world. But, I know very few people who can escape flying, really. I'm talking about ordinary people whose families, are scattered all over the world and who want to see their families. But I do think, for me, the more important thing is that we've developed a culture where it's so fashionable just to have easy holidays, to go on holiday to Sri Lanka or to go wherever you want to go. And it's just taken for granted that, when the school holidays come up, families are going to just get on a plane and go somewhere. I mean, that is we shouldn't be in that world.
Go to Bournemouth.
But having said that,
So there are very few.
I'm being
There are very few ways in which.
really mouthed about this.
There are very few ways in which a different form of consumerism can make a significant difference, because we need systemic change, we need structural change.
Yeah.
But as I think I said in that clip, it's your diet, it's flying, it's also actually your surface transport choices. Ditching the car, cycling, walking, taking public transport. Those are things where we really can make a very significant difference by lifestyle change. The rest of it is bollocks, all those, by all means, don't use a plastic cup and things. It's important not to use a plastic cup, but actually it's much, much more important to look at the system as a whole and look at what it's driving us into, and looking at the way in which the demands of capitalism mean creating new wants, new desires, which simply never existed before, and driving us into believing that our lives are incomplete without this new rubbish that they're throwing at us. Now, I see the junk economy as being a feature, not a bug, of capitalism, because once everyone's needs are met, you have to keep generating rubbish, more and more rubbish. So portable watermelon coolers, smartphones for dogs. I'm not kidding. Beer for dogs, an egg tray, which a Wi-Fi enabled egg tray, which sends a message to your phone telling you when the eggs are running out in your egg tray. I mean, seriously, all these things are real things. An iPotty, so that your toddler can sit on the potty and continue playing on their iPad while they're doing a poo. All this stuff, these are real things which are being sold. And this is basically what the modern economy consists of, because it has to keep growing.
Yeah.
And the only way it can grow is by capturing people's disposable income, so it's aimed at people with disposable income, and getting them to dispose of it. And why would you want to dispose of it if you've already fed, you've got a roof over your head and all the rest of it? Oh, because you don't have a smartphone for your dog.
Yeah.
That's a great. That's the one of the shareables we're doing tonight. So, firstly, you're both familiar with the book "The Uninhabitable Planet" by David Wallace Wells.
Yes.
Have you both read it?
Only extracts, I'm afraid.
Only extract from it, yes.
I was sent 3 copies. I did promise I'd read at least one of them.
It is really good. But one of the questions
it's very depressing.
and this is from Pat H. What do you think about it? But do you think it captures the sort of because it's very, like you say, it's very depressing, the sort of tragic nature of what's happening with not just climate breakdown, but like you say, Earth systems breakdown. Do we need more of that, or does that depress people so much they feel there isn't much point in actually trying to affect change?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you say the end of the world is nigh, people are going to say, well, if the end of the world is nigh, I'm going to party before I die, basically. I think we've got to find ways of empowering people and giving them a narrative, as George says, a positive narrative for a different way of living. We want a world in which your needs are satisfied, not your wants. Well, what are your needs? Well, you'd like a home, wouldn't you? You'd like your children to be happy and healthy and to be able to go to school and be educated and creative. And you'd like to be creative yourself, wouldn't you? These are things that people really need for survival, not their wants. And we have to change that narrative and say, look, if we do switch our economy away from this capitalism drive of endless and exponential consumption, you're going to be a lot happier. We're going to have more solidarity. We're all, and we love it already. People are going to farmers markets. People want to buy stuff that's made locally. We already like that feeling of being connected locally to others and being together. So for me, it's about creating, a positive narrative as well, which will make people feel they want to transform, they want to be part of this transformation, not that it's going to paralyze them and make them feel suicidal, really.
George?
The Christians are right. Despair is a sin.
Yeah.
It's very easy for us living in relative comfort to say, "Oh, I despair of it all.
Yeah.
We're all doomed. There's nothing you can do."
Yeah.
And in doing so, you condemn other people to destitution and death.
Yeah.
Because if we don't take urgent action on climate breakdown and limit it as much as we can, then other people are going to be forced into action, leaving their homes, getting involved in a civil war, whatever it might be, because we've forced that on them. And it's almost a sort of bourgeois affectation where we can say, oh, it's all too awful, we just despair. And you say, yeah, sure, we're going to have horrible losses, maybe it's already too late to save coral reefs, for example. And that is a horrendous thing. I mean, there's unbelievably beautiful, astonishing, necessary ecosystems. But that doesn't mean it's too late for everything. That doesn't mean that we say, okay, because it's too late to save coral reefs, we also give up on rainforests and we allow it to become too hot for that. We give up on Bangladesh. We give up on Honduras. We give up on all these countries which are already being massively afflicted by climate breakdown. That is an indulgence. We can't afford, or other people can't afford that we indulge ourselves that way. We have to take action.
Right, so I've got one more question for both of you. It's a good question, actually. What countries are leading the way on addressing climate change? Anne?
George, I think George.
Yeah, well, actually, it's Costa Rica.
It's Costa Rica.
I know that might not be the most inspiring thing because it's such a small country, but it is brilliant that they are taking it really seriously and actually setting targets which appear to be in line with the science. Now, there was a time, 2008, when the UK was leading the way with our Climate Change Act, and which was actually in line with the science as it was, more or less. It wasn't quite far enough, but it was more or less in line with the science. Now it's been massively overtaken by inaction, the fact that we've left everything so late, and B, the science really firming up and showing us that actually things are a lot worse than we thought.
George, what do you think about China? And what China is doing.
I mean,
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, it's contradictory. I mean, everyone wants to talk about China because China's always been used as the example of why it's completely futile to do anything here. And there was a whole Attenborough program about that in 2006, which was catastrophic.
I don't mean that.
No, I know you don't. And I wasn't suggesting that you do. But all I'm saying is I'm cautioning. Let's not get too distracted by what other countries are doing because everyone has to do it. Every country. If any major economy such as ours doesn't step up and make that commitment, you just ratchet up the level of destruction that much further.
I mean, I agree.
It's just that I was at a meeting with central bankers and they had a Chinese central banker on and who's already talking about greening their balance sheet, i.e. being aware of the brown assets on their balance sheet. And I was European central bankers aren't talking like that yet.
Well, here's the thing. I think in the last 10 years, the People's Army have planted a forest in China the size of Ireland. And that's the sort of thing that Europe and North America.
And partly
needs to be
because
doing.
it is a sort of authoritarian, top-down state. Can it do more?
That's the question. So the neoliberals are asking: is this the future of capitalism, where you have this synthesis of a very powerful state with very powerful markets? But maybe that's also a question on the left, because since 2008 they've laid tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail. 75% of all high-speed trains globally are made by the Chinese,
and they've opened coal mines.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean,
but I have to say this: they've done that with financing from the City of London, through the Export Credit Guarantee, which used to be called the Export Credit Guarantee Department. It's now called Export Finance. They are making finance available to all of these countries that are wanting to grow coal mines, South Africa and so on. And so we are complicit in that, and we do it through this invisible way. I mean, we wanted to launch Aramco, which is the Saudi oil privatized, share, turning into the share market, and we wanted that to happen in London. So we play so while we may be doing the right thing or pretending we do the right thing. I'm very much with what was said today about how hypocritical Britain is about all this, but we use finance to actually stir up, to create, expand the use of carbon around the world, and we do that quietly and behind the scene.
The key task is, when it comes to climate breakdown and Earth system breakdown, is to stop doing the bad stuff. It's doing good stuff is fine. That's great. We need to do some good stuff as well.
But
Actually,
we've got to stop doing
it's leaving
bad
fossil
stuff.
fuels in the ground.
Yeah.
It's stopping the trashing of rainforests. It's stopping building enormous great mines in order to create the new generation of smartphones, whatever it might be. It's actually not doing that bad stuff. Now, and if you judge China or Britain or almost anywhere on that criterion, it doesn't look good. Because China is doing some good stuff, is also doing this massive Belt and Road program, which is going to have huge, devastating implications for people and places everywhere, with an accelerating climate breakdown and environmental breakdown. So it's, if you judge countries on whether or not they've stopped doing the bad stuff, almost all fail catastrophically.
Well, on that note, we're going to finish there. We could have gone all night. Somebody actually said we could have gone all night, but sadly we can't. If you'd like to have maybe a comeback show with these guys, go to support.environment.com. We can do it at some point in the near future. You've both been fantastic.
Just don't compare us to Peterson and Zizek, please.
No. My apologies. Far bigger, far more important. We'll be back again on Monday. James is on Novara FM this Friday, Resonance 104.4 FM and online. I'm Aaron Bastani. Hope you enjoyed the show. See you soon.